Hello and welcome to MRCPsych on the Go Revision Essentials. My name is Dr. Alapasur-Licker and I'm a psychiatry trainee in the west of Scotland. Like many of you, I spent a lot of time commuting. This was valuable time that I could have spent revising for the MRCPsych examination. And so, I've started this podcast to help you revise on the go. Each episode breaks down one high-yield topic mapped to the syllabus. This is then followed by 5 questions to help reinforce your learning. So, grab your headphones, turn travel time into revision time, and let's get started. To start with, let's explore how memory operates. Memory depends on 3 main processes: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding refers to the process of converting sensory information into a form that can be stored in memory. It is most effective when information is meaningful, organised, and linked to existing knowledge. For example, elaborating on new information or relating it to previous experiences can strengthen encoding. Storage refers to maintaining information in memory over time. Some memories are stored only briefly, while others may persist for many years. The durability of stored memories depends on factors such as repetition, emotional significance, and how well the information was encoded. Retrieval refers to accessing stored information when it is needed. Retrieval is often most successful when cues present during learning are also present during recall. This idea is sometimes referred to as encoding specificity. Remember, memory depends on 3 key processes: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding converts sensory information into a storable form, storage maintains information over time, and retrieval refers to accessing stored information when it is needed. One of the earliest models of memory was proposed by the psychologists Richard Atkinson and Richard Schifrin in 1968. This is known as the multi-store model of memory. Their model was influenced by the information processing approach in psychology, which compares the human mind to a computer system that receives, processes, and stores information. Based on experimental findings, they propose that information can be held briefly in short-term memory, but may also be transferred into a more durable long-term store. One important piece of evidence supporting their model comes from free recall experiments, which demonstrated what is known as the serial possession effect. When people are asked to remember a list of items, they tend to recall the first few items and the last few items better than those in the middle. This produces 2 well-known effects: the primacy effect, where early items are remembered well because they have been rehearsed and transferred into long-term memory, and the recency effect, where the last items are remembered well because they are still being held in short-term memory. Atkinson and Schifrin also described a process known as the rehearsal buffer. This refers to the idea that people can actively repeat a limited number of items in short-term memory. By rehearsing information, it can remain in short-term memory for longer and may eventually be encoded into long-term memory. Their model suggested that memory performance could therefore be predicted by how long information remains in this rehearsal process. According to the multi-store model, memory consists of 3 distinct and sequential stores. These are the sensory register, short-term memory, and long-term memory. The sensory register briefly holds incoming sensory information from the environment. This store has a very large capacity, but an extremely short duration, usually lasting less than 1 second. Information that receives attention moves into short-term memory. Short-term memory temporarily stores information that we are actively thinking about. It has a limited capacity and typically holds information for around 18 to 30 seconds without rehearsal. If information is repeated or rehearsed, it can be transferred into long-term memory. Long-term memory has a much larger capacity and can store information for very long periods, potentially for a lifetime. Psychologists often describe each memory store using 3 characteristics: coding, capacity, and duration. Sensory memory stores raw sensory information. Short-term memory typically stores information in an acoustic or sound-based form. Long-term memory is usually stored in a semantic or meaning-based form. Information moves between these stores through several processes. Attention allows information to enter short-term memory. Maintenance rehearsal, such as repeating a phone number, helps keep information in short-term memory. Repeated rehearsal may transfer information into long-term memory. Finally, retrieval occurs when information stored in long-term memory is brought back into short-term memory so that it can be consciously used. Remember, the multi-store model of memory proposed by Atkinson and Shiffrin describes 3 memory stores: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Information flows between these stores through attention, rehearsal, and retrieval. Evidence for this model comes from the serial position effect, where people recall the first items in a list better due to the primacy effect and the last items better due to the recency effect. Another important concept is the capacity of working memory. Working memory refers to the system responsible for temporarily holding and manipulating information during cognitive tasks. Research by the psychologist George Miller suggested that the capacity of short-term or working memory is approximately 7 items plus or minus 2. However, memory capacity can be increased using a strategy known as chunking. Chunking involves grouping smaller units of information into larger, meaningful units. For example, remembering the numbers 20241945 may be difficult, but if grouped as 2024 and 1945, the information becomes easier to retain. Remember, short-term memory has a limited capacity of approximately 7 items, plus or minus 2, as described by George Miller. Chunking improves memory capacity by organising information into meaningful groups. Later research suggested that short-term memory is not simply a single storage system. In 1974, psychologists Alan Baddeley and Graham Hitch proposed the working memory model. Working memory refers to the system responsible for temporarily holding and manipulating information during cognitive tasks. Unlike the earlier concept of short-term memory, working memory involves several specialized components that work together. The central executive controls attention and coordinates the other components. The phonological loop processes verbal and auditory information. The visuospatial sketchpad processes visual and spatial information. Later, Baddeley added a 4th component called the episodic buffer, which integrates information from different sources and links working memory with long-term memory. Remember, the working memory model describes a system for temporarily holding and manipulating information. It includes the central executive, phonological loop, visuospatial sketchpad, and episodic buffer. Long-term memory is also not a single system. Psychologist Endel Tulving proposed that long-term memory includes different types of memory. Episodic memory refers to memory for personal experiences and events. For example, remembering a specific conversation or a recent holiday. Semantic memory refers to general knowledge about the world. For example, knowing that London is the capital of the United Kingdom. Another form of long-term memory is procedural memory, sometimes called skills memory. Procedural memory stores information about how to perform actions and skills. Examples include riding a bicycle or typing on a keyboard. Remember, long-term memory includes episodic memory for personal experiences, semantic memory for knowledge, and procedural memory for skills. Now, let's test your recall. I will read out 5 exam-style questions. After each one, I will pause for 10 seconds so you can attempt the answer before hearing the explanation. Question 1. A psychiatry trainee is trying to remember a patient's medication list. First, they take in the information, then hold it in memory, and later recall it during ward rounds. Which 3 basic processes of memory are involved in this sequence? The answer is encoding, storage, and retrieval. Question 2. A psychology student learns that memory involves information passing through sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Which psychologists proposed this model of memory? The answer is Atkinson and Shiffrin. Question 3. A doctor is trying to remember a long patient identification number. Instead of remembering each digit separately, they group the digits into meaningful clusters. What memory strategy are they using? The answer is chunking. Question 4. Which psychologist proposed that short-term memory capacity is approximately 7 items plus or minus 2? The answer is George Miller. And finally, question 5. A patient is asked to remember a phone number while also solving a reasoning task. The psychologist explains that this task involves a memory system with a central executive, phonological loop, and visuospatial sketchpad. Which model of memory describes this system? The answer is the working memory model proposed by Baddeley and Hitch. Let's summarise what we have learnt today. Memory involves 3 key processes: encoding, storage, and retrieval. The multi-store model, proposed by Atkinson and Shiffrin, describes 3 memory stores: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Information moves between these stores through attention, rehearsal, and retrieval. Evidence for this model comes from the serial possession effect, where people tend to recall the first items in a list better due to the primacy effect, and the last items better due to the recency effect, while items in the middle are recalled less well. Research by George Miller showed that short-term memory has a limited capacity of approximately 7 items, plus or minus 2. This capacity can be increased through the strategy of chunking. The working memory model explains how information is temporarily stored and manipulated during cognitive tasks. This is through the components of the central executive, phonological loop, visuospatial sketchpad, an episodic buffer. Finally, Endel Tulving proposed that long-term memory includes different systems, including episodic memory for personal experiences, semantic memory for knowledge, and procedural memory for skills. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of MRCPsych on the Go Revision Essentials. I hope this episode helped to move your revision forward. If you have any questions or just want to continue the discussion, you can find me on LinkedIn at MRCPsych on the Go, spelled MRCPysch on the go. This podcast is about making revision accessible. If you found it useful, liking and sharing it with others helps the goal more than anything else. That's it for today. I'm Dr. Alapas Ehrlicher, and as always, keep revising on the go.